know is Shmini Atzeret, which is kind of a mysterious holiday. What are we celebrating on Shmini Atzeret? Who knows?
The 8th day of assembly.
There you go. We're celebrating that it's the 8th day. Pretty exciting. So, in the Bible, there is often, not that much information, about what the content of the holiday is, right? The sort of for me, the most telling one is Rosh Hashanah. What does it say about Rosh Hashanah in the Bible?
First day of the year.
Right. It's the first day of the year, right? And what day is it? Yom Teruah. Right. It's the day we blow the shofar. Oi, that's it. No more information than that. So hold on one second. I tell you. Some of you at least.
What's today?
What is today? Today is Monday.
Oh, okay.
Today is Monday. All right. So what we do on Shmini Atzeret, and I think what we'll do is we will go to. I think what we're going to do is instead of trying to put this on the screen, since no one is on Zoom, we don't really need to do the screen. I think what we'll do is I'll get the prayer books because what I thought we would do is look at some of the liturgy. What we did last week for Sukkot, right, was look at some of the liturgy and figure out, what.
And 100 Center Street, they have the same Sidurim, so fun.
This at 100 Center Street, they have the red Sidurim now, but that is only because of COVID, I brought them over. What we have here is the old Sim Shalom.
But are they on
So,
Zoom?
We can look at Sim Shalom, but I have the red one here in case. And we can compare what it says in Sim Shalom to what it says in the red one, if we're interested in comparing. It's always interesting to compare translations, right? Both because, of course, because every generation needs its own translation, or as a colleague of mine says,
Thank you.
and
Read
you're
any
okay.
language.
Great. And he's even more he's a bit more cynical than I am. He just thinks that every what is going on here? Okay, yeah, I got it. He just thinks that every translator needs a new translation. That why do we need a new prayer? Why do we need a new translation of the prayer book if I'm not going to put my mark on it? And he thinks that very often leads to bad translations because God forbid, right? You use the translation that a previous translator had made. That would be, acknowledging that maybe you don't have anything to add. So whatever. But so the specific thing we do on Shmini Atzeret is a very odd holiday because, as we discussed, right, what are we celebrating on Shmini Atzeret? We're celebrating that it's the 8th day, right, of Sukkot, right? And it's very interesting that as often happens, right, we need to sort of figure out, well, what are we going to do, right? What are we going to do during the service? And there's also this related problem, right? That in the diaspora, right, in the land of Israel, how many days of Shmini Atzeret is there?
7.
Well, look, there's 7 days of Sukkot, right? So the 8th day is just the 8th day, right? There's no 9th day.
No.
Right? There's no 9th day of Sukkot, right? There is, however, right, in the diaspora, there is the tradition, right, that we have 2 days of the holiday. So on the first and second day of Sukkot, fine, right? We get to sit in the sukkah, we shake the lulav, right? We're having a good time. If the first day of Sukkot turns out to have been on a Shabbos, right? It's actually really convenient to have a second day, right? Because we can then do the Hoshanot, right? The prayers that we say as we walk around the synagogue with the lulavim, right? We can do that. It's not like in Reform synagogues, right, have this in the Reform movement, they decided they were going to not have 2 days of the Chag, which, for the most part, I think is a good idea, right? I mean, who needs 2 days? It's hard enough to get a minyan, right? For 1 day of Chag, why are we going to try to have 2, right? The problem, of course, is if the first day of Sukkot is on Shabbos, and you're not supposed to pick up the lulavim on Shabbos, that means that technically you're not supposed to touch the lulavim at all on Sukkot, right? And so I don't know what do they do in Israel in that case? I guess they just don't touch it on the actual day of Chag. They wait till Chol HaMoed, right? Wait till Sunday to do it. So anyway, so it's a little bit complicated, right? So what do we do when Shmini Atzeret, right, is we're celebrating the 8th day of Chag, right? What do we do on the 9th day of Chag? Right? We just celebrate the 8th day of Chag again, right? It's a little crazy. So what ended up happening from a historical perspective, which I think is really interesting, right, is that we decided when the Jews finally decided how we were going to read the Torah, right? What was the decision? Were we going to read it according to the Palestinian tradition, right, where we finish the Torah in about 3 years or so, or are we going to do it in the Babylonian tradition where we read it the whole thing in a year? Right? We decide upon if anyone tells you that the true Judaism is only in Israel, you can say, well, we read the Torah according to the Babylonians, right? The true Judaism, at least as regards reading the Torah, is from the diaspora, right? Yeah. And one of the reasons, one of the ways that this all worked out, I think, quite beautifully in the diaspora, right, is that Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot, was Shmini Atzeret. And we didn't call the second day of Shmini Atzeret the second day of Shmini Atzeret. We call it Simchat Torah.
Oh, actually.
Right? We call it the celebration of the Torah. And that's the day when we finish, right, the Torah. And what do the very next moment? We start the Torah all over again, right? It's the most, and it's a great thing, right? So we read V'zot HaBracha. It's the only time during the year that we read V'zot HaBracha, and this is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, gives to the people Israel, right? And then it runs through various blessings. The one that I was preparing this Torah reading last night for tomorrow, and my favorite one so far is Livnei Binyamin, right, to the children of Benjamin. He said, Yedid Adonai, right, the beloved of God. It's a nice thing to call someone, Yedid Adonai. Anyway, so that's what we have on the 9th day. What day should Simchat Torah be then? Should it be tomorrow? No, it should be Wednesday. So in Israel, right, you've got a little bit of a dilemma. Right? Wait, is it Shmini Atzeret or is it Simchat Torah that we celebrate? Well, we're Jews, so what do? We do both. The rule of the Jews, right? Never throw anything away, right? It's all holy. It's all too precious, right? To throw away. God forbid we give up Shmini Atzeret or Simchat Torah, right? Because they're both. So we have to figure out a way to combine them. Yeah, go ahead.
I happened to be reading the English of the Haftorah this week, and they were talking about when the second time Moses went up after he broke the first one. And what do? They don't throw that away. They took the broken pieces and they put them in the Aron HaKodesh and
Right.
they traveled with it.
Absolutely.
And that's what you do. You never throw anything or anyone away.
Right.
Even if they're old, infirmed, or whatever.
Exactly.
And I said, oh, my husband is so religious.
Right.
He never throws.
He never goes right. So there's a difference between not throwing things away and hoarding, right? It's a very fine line, right? The Jews are not hoarders, right? We just don't throw things away. But a hoarder, that's a different thing.
That's why after many weddings, when they break the glass, and that glass can be fashioned
Fashion, yeah.
into candelabra.
Yes, yes. And there's another tradition.
Right.
There's another, you can buy a kit from the Judaica store. And the glass is rainbow colored. And you smash the glass and then you pour it into a mezuzah holder.
I like that.
And so the mezuzah holder has this rainbow glass in it, and there's a mezuzah, and it's the, on one hand, it's it's the broken glass, right? It's the reminder, right, that there's, even in the moments of greatest joy, right, there's always the memory of the fact that there's brokenness, and at the same time that brokenness is transformed into this beautiful object.
That's
Right.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I love the idea, like in Reform congregation, when they unroll the scroll all the way around.
That's what we do next door.
Yeah, they do it at TBZ too. Well, TBZ is one of this congregations, like, it's not a Hebrew college congregation, obviously, it was before Hebrew college, but it has many of the same impulses, right? And my congregation in Cambridge is the same way, right? Where if it's a Reform tradition, but it's a beautiful tradition, we use it, right? And if it's a conservative tradition, it's a beautiful condition, we use it. And if it's Orthodox and it's beautiful, we use it, right? It's that sort of, we're not gonna get, I'm always fascinated by, actually, the most recent was Chabad. I was looking at the Chabad website and it said something about why Chabad doesn't want you to sleep in the sukkah. I didn't even look at it. I was interested, but I was in too much of a rush. But I was like, wow, Chabad has its own sort of take, right? And this is why does the Reform movement not want you to sleep in the sukkah, or why does the conservative movement want you to sleep? Very interesting to me. And I'm like, and on one hand, of course, it's always very important, right? That, we come from a specific, like what we call this in Judaism, minhag avotenu. It should be minhag avotenu ve'imotenu, right? Because it's very often the mothers who carry the traditions as much as the fathers. But the idea that, the customs we grew up with, right? Those are the ones that are somehow most precious to us, right? So we should say, we're Chabad, so this is what we do, or we grew up in the Reform movement, so this is what we do. But there's also, on the other hand, right, this sort of thing, well, wait, none of these groups has a monopoly on all the good ideas, right? And
That's why we duchen.
what?
That's why we have duchening.
Right. We're duchening at KI, right? Jude, it's so good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much
need
for
to
joining
go,
us.
And I hope next time.
I hope
will.
next time you'll be able to stick around a little longer, but you'll do what you can.
Father,
It's great to see you. Chag Sameach.
thanks a lot to everyone.
Okay.
And thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Nikki.
That you just used as an example that Chabad says you shouldn't sleep in the sukkah. Since my kids grew up, especially when we lived in more places, because besides just that maybe it's their minhag, is there?
To be honest, I was in such a rush, it was actually interesting. I was looking for material about Sukkot in Russian. And so I was on the Russian Chabad site, and it said, Почему мы не спим в sukkah, right? Why don't we, why does in Chabad, why don't we sleep in the sukkah? I was like, I don't have time. but now that it's too late, I'm interested to know.
But it'll be in your mind to look it up.
Yeah, exactly. If it crosses my mind again. So getting back, right? So for Shmini Atzeret in Simchat Torah, right? The service that we'll do tomorrow, right? And I'm assuming that this is going to be similar to what happens next door, although I really don't know what they do next door for
I'll
these.
tell you.
Everything.
Right, so that's what we do, but we not really everything, right? Because we don't do 2 Torah readings, right? We do the Torah reading for Simchat Torah, right? Because it's the one time a year, right, that we can read this Torah portion. And whatever the Torah reading is for Shmini Atzeret, which is not in my head at this moment, right, that one is read at another point during the year, right? So we do read Simchat Torah and we read the first chapter of Joshua, right, as the Haftarah. We do Yizkor, which is Shmini Atzeret, right? And we do Geshem, right, the prayer for rain, right, which is also Shmini Atzeret and not Simchat Torah. But we do the Hakafot, right? So Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret together are kind of a funny mix, right, tonally, right? Because on one hand, we have Yizkor, we're really, really sad. On the other hand, we are dancing with the Torah, we're really, really happy. It's a very strange day, yeah.
When I first moved here and I went next door for Simchas Torah, it was the first time I saw that opening the hotel
Yeah.
room. And it was beautiful because at each section, someone, man, woman, or child, said something about that portion.
Yeah.
And it was just beautiful. And it was very, to me, the only thing I've seen in the Torah, I don't lame, is when they hold it up, I can read it.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, but it was just so meaningful to see that
Yeah,
all around the show. And then they carefully, they rolled it up.
right,
And I could see the children, they learned the most from it.
yeah,
Yeah.
That they could touch the Torah.
right.
It was
Right.
beautiful.
Yeah. But I want,
They won't do it tomorrow because of COVID.
right, and I probably won't do, I usually do it at 100 Center Street. Traditionally, I do it one book at a time. We don't have enough people
Right.
to do the whole Torah at once. We do one book at a time. But I probably won't do it again because it's, people have to be too close. But thank you, Ruth, for mentioning, right, the sacred fragments, right, the pieces of the tablets that when Moses either drops them or throws them down, depending on your interpretation, right, that those are not thrown away. So often people take it as I'm joking about the Jews not throwing anything away, but it's actually, you're right, it is actually a very serious.
And if a sitter is torn, in my show, we would collect them, and then when someone died, we would bury it. Section where you could bury.
We bring them to the Geniza,
I had a
exactly.
lot of keep when my father died, and I said to the rabbi, what do I do with them? He said, they have no religious significance.
Right.
You can, throw them away. I said, no, I'm not gonna throw them away. I eventually gave them away.
Yeah.
But,
So, all right, so I thought what we would do is look at the prayer for rain to start with, because that's the most prevalent, or not prevalent, it's the most distinctive part of Shmini Atzeret, right? The rest, everything else for Shmini Atzeret, right, is essentially the same as the liturgy for Regalim, just for the festivals, and which is not to say it's not worth looking at, or in Hallel is always worth looking at, right? But since Geshem is really distinctive, we really only get it once a year. I thought it would be worth looking at. Of course, now,
483.
wow, amazing.
What page?
483. Okay, thank you, Ruth.
Just 43?
483.
Oh, 483.
All right, so but actually, let's push back. So let's go to 478 first.
Okay.
Just to point out, right, that this structure, right, the two, and it's also important to sort of point out, I think, right, that even though we have three pilgrimage holidays, right, really, it's probably more accurate to say either that we have two or that we have four, right, one or the other.
What's the difference between dew, Tal, and Geshem?
There we go, right?
One is dew and one's rain.
One is
I know
dew and
that,
one is
but I
rain,
mean,
right?
it's
So
just-
so this is what I'm getting at, right? Because we have Sukkot, right, which ends with Shmini Atzeret, right? Is it its own pilgrimage holiday, or is it just the 8th day of Sukkot, right? Not entirely clear. It's treated by Jews, right, as more or less just the end of Sukkot, right? Then in the spring, we have Pesach, of course, right? And then we have this other holiday, Shavuot, right? Which is how many days?
Two.
Two in the diaspora and one, right?
Israel.
One in Israel, right? So it's a single, it's just like Shmini Atzeret, right? Except instead of being just a week after the first day, right? It's 7 weeks. So I don't have an answer, is it 2 or is it 4, right? Again, we don't like to make decisions like that, so we say we have 3, right? We have Pesach, we have Shavuot, right? And then we have Sukkot, and Sukkot has this additional thing. But what's important, right, is that as regards the agricultural aspects of it, and hello, Eleanor, come on in. Hello, I've got a book for you right here. Nice to see you. Eleanor is coming over from 100 Center Street.
Oh.
So on Pesach, we read this prayer for dew, right? And on Shmini Atzeret, we read the prayer for rain. So why would we pray for dew in the spring and rain in the fall?
I think it could be the opposite.
Well, so
Spring showers.
right, so the beginning of the answer, right, the beginning of the answer is to recognize, right, that when we are making these prayers, right, we're not talking about where we are necessarily.
Yeah.
If we're in the land of Israel, then we're talking about where we are. Right? If we're in North America or in China or in Russia or anywhere else, right,
Understood.
we're talking about Eretz Yisrael, right? And so how many seasons do we have in Eretz Yisrael?
2.
2, right? We have the rainy season and the dry season, right? And so but do we really want the dry season to be completely dry? No. My God forbid, right? So we know there's not going to be rain, right? Because that's just not the way it works, right? But we want there to be dew in the morning.
Okay. that
Right.
makes sense.
Go ahead, Sue.
There's a very good film on now on Netflix, which maybe people read the book or something. It's called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And it takes place in Malawi. And they have 2 seasons. The same like Israel.
Yeah.
So it was just, I was watching it and I thought, I guess they thought it was unusual and I thought, no, I know another place that has that.
Yeah. So again, this is one of the reasons why it might make more sense, right, to think about our regalim, right, more as 2, right, than as 3. And we still have the problem, right, that there's 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, right? So if we're gonna go to Jerusalem, right, we have to go home and come back, right? One of the things they say though about Shmini Atzeret, right, is why is Shmini Atzeret only a week after Sukkot and not 7 weeks like Shavuot, right? In part, it's because, right, which it's related to the reason that we don't pray for rain on Sukkot, right? We pray for dew on the first day of Passover. We only pray for rain on the last day of Sukkot, right, on Shmini Atzeret. Why? Because we don't want the rain to come before we get home.
Right.
Right? We're not in our tractor trailers or our minivans, right? We're walking or maybe we're in carts, whatever it is, right? If there's a lot of rain, right, our roads become impassable. We can't get home, right? So we pray for rain at the end of the festival, right? And we also are hoping that the rain is going to come, so we don't assume we can get back to Jerusalem in the middle of the winter. Now, of course, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Isn't it more realistic though to pray for rain at the end in Israel because that's when it's going to rain?
Right?
It hardly ever rains when I was there, it rained in September and everybody went wild with amazement.
Right.
So are we just really adjusting to what realistically happens rather than giving a reason?
I mean, that you're pointing at something that I think is really a fascinating question, right? Which I think is it's in the realm of rabbinic discourse about prayer, right? That we generally we're not encouraged by the rabbis to pray for things that are impossible, right? So not only would it not be desirable to have rain in the summer in Israel, right? It also is not really possible, right? It doesn't happen, right? And so when do you pray for the rain? You pray for the rain when it's time for rain. And you don't pray for rain at times when it's not time for rain.
It just makes sense.
It just doesn't make sense, right? And so there is always, so I think you're absolutely right. On the other hand, right, drought is not unknown, right? So we pray for rain when it's the appropriate time for rain, knowing that this could be a drought year, and we don't want it to be, right? We've had a drought year in California, right? Year after year after year after year. So when we pray for rain these days, I'm always in the back of my head, like, yes, of course, I'm talking about Eretz Yisrael, but I'm also talking about, the drought-ridden areas of our own country, right? Because of the effects, right, that the dry, hot weather has had on humans. It's not just humans I'm worried about, but but drought is a real problem. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So, and again, when we think about prayer, right, what is it really that we should be praying for? Is always a question in the back of my mind. Is it a reasonable thing that we're praying? Are the prayers we're making, are they reasonable? And it's always an interesting question. All right, so Tal, right? So notice here, so we won't look at the Tal. We'll do that at Pesach, maybe. When Pesach comes around, we can look at Tal. But just to point out the structure of how this works, right? So after the Torah service, right? When we do Musaf, right? And there's usually only do they do an actual Musaf for Tal? Because in the congregation in Cambridge, where I'm at, there's not really a Musaf, right, that we do. And so there has to be it's like a really special occasion, right? We actually do Musaf for Shmini Atzeret, because without the Musaf, you kind of don't have the special prayer. So you do it when do you do it, right? So the sequence of prayers for the Amidah, right? It's the Musaf prayer, so it's the Amidah. Does everyone know what Musaf is?
Yeah, in addition.
The additional prayer, right? There's always an additional prayer that happens on Shabbat and holidays, right? And it always has something to do with the special day, right? So, and the first blessing of the Amidah is called Avot, and these days we call Avot ve'imahot, right? The fathers and the mothers, right? And it's about our ancestors, right? It's about invoking the merit of our ancestors, of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? And we say, God, remember how great they were, right? Let a little bit of that rub off on us, right? What's the second blessing we do?
Nekadesh.
That's the third, right? That's the third, right? Which is the Kedusha, right? The second one is called Givurot, right? It's about God's power, right? And it has to do specifically with God's power to bring life, right? It's about God bringing life, right? So If you look here on, I'm sure it's the same on page 483. Yeah, so look on page 483. Right, you'll see that the prayer goes, Shield of Abraham, right? And then it says, your might, O Lord, is boundless. You give life to the dead. Great is your saving power. Hello, Ilan, how are you?
You were so kind to say hello. I just had to come in.
Of course, so glad to see you.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, so we're on 483 in case you have lost track of the page. All right. So the prayer for Tal and for Geshem always happens in the second blessing, which has to do with God's power to bring life, right? To bring, and as it says in this prayer book, you give life to the dead. Let's see what it says in this prayer book. I'm sure it's a little different because, as I said, no, you give life to the dead. He didn't change it. Very impressive. But I was going to look up Geshem in here. So right there, right before we get to anything else, in that second blessing, we go directly into the prayer for rain. So Suzanne, why don't you read the first one?
Where am I reading?
Page 43, our God and God of our ancestors.
Page 43?
483.
Yeah, that's what I have.
Yeah, 483.
God and God of our ancestors, remember Abraham, his heart poured out to you like water. You blessed him as a tree planted near water. You saved him when he went through fire and water.
There we go. For Abraham's sake,
Do not withhold water.
there we go. So you've got it, right? So again, how does it work, right? How does it work with this prayer? Just like with the Amidah in general, we remember Abraham, right? Zechor av nimshach acharecha kamayim, right? And now, very important to recognize that in the Hebrew, right, it's not Abraham. It doesn't say Abraham, right? It says Av, right? The father, right? And so in this other translation that I have in front of me, in this book, it says, remember the patriarch who was drawn to you like water, right? So this is poetry, right? So the translations are not going to be particularly, exactly like completely exact, right? You blessed him as a tree planted amid flowing water. You protected and saved him when he went through fire and water. Interesting. There's a little bit more here. You loved him as he sowed righteousness upon all the world's waters. For his sake, do not withhold water. Right. So, and notice it's a little bit hard to tell in this edition, but if you look, if you read it in Hebrew, Zechor Av Nimshach Acharecha Kamayim Berachto Ke'etz Shatul Al Palgei Mayim Ginanto, right? Hitzalto me'esh u mimayim darashto bezar'o al kol mayim, right? So you'll notice, right, that it's an acrostic, right? So Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and Dalet, which is a little bit hard to see here because they don't make a big deal of it. In this edition, if you look up up in front of you, right, you'll see that this edition is actually very helpful. It puts it in order, right? And you can see, and it bolds each of the initial letters. So unfortunately, this edition didn't do it. So that is an improvement.
So is that Sim Solo also?
This is Lev Shalem. Shalem. This is the new, I don't know what the prayer book that Rabbi Bill uses,
Facts.
the Sacks, I don't know what they do. But it doesn't matter, the words are the same, right? But the layout is really can be very helpful.
As soon as I go upstairs.
Right, so for Abraham's sake, do not withhold water, right? We want water, right? And so again, we'll see in this liturgy, right, in this poetry, right, that the importance of water, right, as an agricultural element, right, is spiritualized, right? Right? It's Abraham, right? Abraham is like a tree, right? He went through fire and water, but don't and in his Darash Tov Bizarro, he translated as you loved him as he sowed righteousness upon all the world's waters. It's not really clear to me exactly what Darash Tov Bizarro means. I don't know if it means that. But notice that in this book, they don't even translate that line because it's really obscure, which is also consistent with a lot of this liturgy, right? It's very, very obscure. It's not always clear exactly what it's talking about. And so sometimes it's easier just not to translate it because, yeah, go ahead, Mickey.
This is a negative question.
Okay.
Most of mine seem to be. We say Machaye Meitir Matar Rav Hashir
Yeah.
in more than one place.
Yes.
And as we're reading this now, so it has occurred to me in the synagogue. Is this hopeful that we're saying it? I mean, I gather that when Mashiach comes, you give life to the dead, but this sounds like you give life to the dead as you do. But our God, Christian God, does.
Right.
God, we don't see God.
Oh, yes.
Why do we say that? Are
It's-
we grooming
right.
God?
That's a fascinating question, right? And different streams of Judaism deal with that question differently, right? In the Reform movement, right, it is it's such a problem in the Reform movement, and I don't know if the problem has to do with just the notion, right, that God gives life, and it sounds magical, or if it's because it sounds so Christian. Whatever it is in the Reform movement, you don't say that. They don't say Mechei Meitim. They say Mechei Hakol, right? Gives life to everything, right? Because it's too controversial,
I didn't know.
right? But yes, it can sound Christian, right? But I don't know if it was with this group last week or the group at 100 Center Street. I was saying this is sort of the problem of sibling rivalry, right? If Junior comes along and decides that he's going to be like his dad and play football, right? Then when Trip comes along, he's going to say, I'm not going to have anything to do, right, with football. I'm gonna go out and do ballet, right? So like if you're really close to one another, right, very often you want to emphasize what's different as opposed to what's the same, right? So one of the things that Judaism and Christianity share, right, is this notion, right, that God has this power, right, to give life where there was death, right? And again, in the Jewish context, there's nothing miraculous about this, right? It's just a recognition, right, as with Geshem, right, that the rains come in the fall and they water the dry earth, and then the earth will come back to life, right? It's like what we see one of the reasons I think that we have Pesach in the spring, right? It's also kind of a spring holiday, right? The world is coming back to life at the end of the winter. That really works, right, in our northern hemisphere perspective, right? It works a little bit less well right, in a Southern Hemisphere perspective. Right, it was a colleague of mine grew up in South Africa, right? And so what was summer camp? For them, summer camp was Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah on the beach, right? For us, what's summer camp? Summer camp is Tisha B'Av.
So Claudia had a really hard time with that
Yeah,
for a long time.
right.
Yeah.
With what?
Well, she grew up in Chile.
Oh, I didn't know exactly what the what was. Oh, so
yeah,
the southern,
but, you know,
the Southern Hemisphere thing, yes.
especially- Right.
Yeah.
You talk about Hanukkah,
Right.
for her, it was summertime.
Right.
Right.
Hanukkah is a summertime holiday. What do you mean? Why is it conflated with Christmas? Although must be conflated with Christmas down there too. It's just that down there, Christmas is a summer holiday also, right? So, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When we used to go camping in Puerto Rico, Christmas vacation,
Yeah.
school vacation, all the cabanas were all decorated
Yeah.
with Santa Claus.
Yeah.
And they all went caroling.
Yeah.
From cabana to cabana. It was-
That's great.
So did Christianity pick Macaye made him get up and then later make a whole, I can say then, I'm gonna say mythology, but what seems to me to be a mythology around that.
Right. Well, I mean, note that Easter happens when?
Spring.
In the spring, right? I mean, it's time of rebirth, right? It's, and again, so much of Christianity, right, is Judaism grafted onto Greek mystery religions, right? And one of the big parts of the Greek mystery religions, right, is the death and the rebirth of God, right? That's what we have in Christianity. So, Michai Meitim, right, is just a part of our common heritage, right, with the Christians. They take it in a particular direction, and it's just one of the things we do. But it's important, right, because the centerpiece of the liturgy for Pesach and for Shmini Atzeret, right, the centerpiece of that liturgy are these prayers talking about God's capacity to bring life in the context of death.
I find it really tough.
Yeah.
Because as a kid, I was in the conservative synagogue, a good Hebrew school, and I believed Macaye made him.
Yeah.
And I was a kid whose mom got ill young. And was one of the first people with chemotherapy. And I remember thinking, that's what happened. That she was almost dead. And God gave her life. Through
So powerful.
But then in the end, it doesn't work.
Well,
So,
I mean, right. I mean, and that is in the category of, one of these things where, to what degree are we recognizing, right, that the world and God has this miraculous capacity, right, to transform what feels like death into life. And then on the other hand, are we, when someone is dying, right, does it really make sense for us to pray for them to continue to live, right? It's a very complicated set of questions. Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
I think it's like a metaphor. That life could be the memories
Yes,
that remain alive.
right. There's so many different ways of thinking about life out of death, right? And what is the one, and that's so touching, Connie, right? Because what is the word that's here, right? The first word is Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu zechor. Remember, right? And if we're calling on God to remember, what are we actually saying to ourselves? We should remember, right? Right? And so whom are we going to remember? We're going to remember our patriarchs. And, and if Geshem were written not hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right, we would probably remember the Imahot as well. All right, so we're going to remember Abraham, right? And then the next, we're gonna remember whom we're gonna remember, who would be the next one we would remember? Isaac, of course. And just to point out again, right, that the poet never names them, right? It's one of these things that, you know, the translator has a decision to make here. Is he going to name the patriarchs as they do, this is Harlow, by the way. Harlow names the patriarch, right, to make it clear. Part of the reason he does that, right, is because there is no commentary on this page, right? In Lev Shalem, this is Feld. Ed Feld is the guy who did this version, right? He doesn't name them in the text of the prayer itself. Why? In part because he has commentary, right, where he can explain what's going on here, right? So if we don't catch, right, that the patriarch, you know, who was drawn to God like water, right, and who was the most righteous man of the world, whatever, blah blah blah, you know, save for Moses, right? That's Abraham, right? He can say it in the side, right? All right, so let's read this second. Go ahead, Ruth.
It's continued. If you look on, pick any page that starts Baruch atah Adonai, and it says Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak,
Yeah.
Elohei Yaakov.
Yeah.
Now it's adding Imahot.
Right,
So that is not just for this, but it's.
Right.
Brachot.
right. So here, right, what we have, so we'll go through the whole thing here, right? We'll come quickly because we're coming to the end. Right, remember Isaac? His birth foretold while angels drank cool water. What is that referring to?
Well.
The way when the visitors come to visit Abraham,
Yeah.
right? They come with news for Sarah, right? And Abraham, you know, so that's how this a lot of Jewish liturgical poetry works, right? It sort of points you back to the Bible, right? Back to episodes.
And Yitzchak, when she laughed.
Yes, exactly. At Moriah, his blood was almost spilled like water, right? Because Abraham almost killed him, right? In the desert, he dug deep to find springs of water, right? Because that's what Isaac is known for, right? Digging wells, right? Okay. And then the third one, right, is Jacob, right, who with his staff forded Jordan's water. Gallantly, he showed his love beside a well of water, right? Whom was he in love with?
Rachel.
He fell in love with Rachel. Where did they fall in love?
At the well.
At the well.
While
Right.
she was offering him water.
Right. Exactly. Right. So that you can see how the mind of the liturgist works, right? What are the various scenes involving water, right, that we can bring forward, right, to associate both in our minds, but also right in the divine mind, right, between the patriarchs and what we want the water, bring the water, right? We don't want drought, right? And struggled victoriously with a creature of fire and water, right? What are the creatures of fire and water? The angels, right? And Jacob wrestled with the angel, right? All right. So remember Moses, right?
That's sort of obvious.
Right, whose basket rocked in reeds and water. In Midian, he gave his sheep ample grass and water. That's a little bit of a stretch, but okay. He struck the rock, right? Oh, and it's funny in the setting of this prayer that I use, in the musical setting of this prayer that I use, it says, Al Hasela ha ha, Al Hasela ha ha ha. It is very funny. I'm like, why do they have this in the middle of? And I'm like, oh, I guess because they want to sort of have us really, feel right. Like it's not just. So it's like again. It's not just about. Oh yeah, there was that episode with Moses and the rock and the water, right? But also just like we really.
There's a word for that.
That's got
There's a
more
poetic word for that.
Oh,
And they wrote Moses last.
no, not last, right? Then so the next one, right? Remember Aaron, right? Moses' brother,
Yeah.
right? The priest in his ritual immersions in water, right? Because every time he needs to be purified in order to do the holy office, right? He has He has to immerse in water. On Yom Kippur, he kept the rites with water, right? Very interesting, right? Shmini Atzeret, right? We talked about this last week, right? Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret happens right after Yom Kippur, right? So here is a reference, right, to Yom Kippur. Right? He read from the Torah and bathed himself in water. I don't know if Aaron himself actually read from the Torah. That's a good question, right? But the high priest, right? We're already talking about. So again, we get the sense again, right? Another thing about we talked about this last week in terms of Judaism and memory, right? Is that it's a big part of our Jewish memory, right? Is taking this one from this episode from over here and this episode from over here and smushing them together, right? So did Aaron ever read the Torah? No, but the high priest had to read the Torah. So Aaron was the high priest. He must have read the Torah.
Exactly, right.
And then finally, right, remember Israel's tribes, right? So now we're moving from the patriarchs, right? And the final verse, right, is everybody, right? Which is connected. And I don't know, again, like I don't want to make too much of it, right? But in Zot HaBracha, right? What is the Zot HaBracha, that little Torah portion that we read only on Simchat Torah, is literally the blessing given to all of the tribes of Israel, right? So it even though for the rabbis, right, these are separate holidays, right? We have Simchat Torah the second day, we have Shmini Atzeret the first day, right? It actually works to do them together, right? Because this prayer seems to.
Is that why everybody gets under the talus and gets a bracha?
Right. So right, that's a lovely thought, right? That remember all of Israel's tribes, everybody gets an aliyah on Simchat Torah, right?
Starting with
I'm sorry?
starting with the rabbis and then the teachers and then the scholars.
Right. Everybody gets an aliyah, even the Pintel Yid who doesn't come to shul except for, all right. For their sake, brackish marsh became sweet water, right? Remember again from Torah, right? Where there's nothing but bitter water and Moses, touches it with his staff, right? And it becomes sweet. Right? And then we switch to a completely different, much more Shmini Atzeret kind of key, right? Their descendants' blood was spilled for you like water, right? So remember, this is Shmini Atzeret, right? Remember that this is a sad, as holidays go, it's on the sadder side, right? We have Yizkor, right? And we're worried, right? We're worried about drought, right? We don't want there to be drought, right? So remember, just like we do on Yom Kippur, remember how much we've given up for you, God, right? Remember all those that we have lost because of Kiddush Hashem, right? For those who have given up their lives for you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
A little bit different. It's just a simple question. Okay. Why did the reform movement eliminate duchening? Why?
Well, they didn't eliminate duchening as the reform movement decided that the division of Jews into Kohanim, Leviim in Yisrael, right, was no longer relevant because there's no more temple, and right, that it led to division among Jews, right? That people were like one of the points of having Kohanim, Leviim in Israel, right, is so that there was no dissension, right? Everyone got what they were supposed to have, right? If you're a Kohen, you're supposed to get the first aliyah. You're not supposed to get one of the other aliyahs, right? Because those are for the other people, right? But human beings being human beings, right? Oh, I'm a Kohen, I'm better than everybody else, right? And so the reform movement was like, we don't need this sort of these distinctions, right? And sort of giving people an opportunity to claim that they're better or worse than the other people. And so they decided that it was no longer relevant. But also very important that there's not the messianic idea, right? Of the Mashiach coming and rebuilding the temple and Reform Judaism. So that's another reason. Yeah.
I have kind of a tangential
Yeah.
question. My son-in-law